Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony and Ingrassia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. I'm really glad that you could be with me today, and I'm really very excited about my special guest today, and I've really been looking forward to this interview with Dr. Dan Allender. So, Dr. Allender, thank you so much for being a guest on the Power of Purity podcast.
Tony, thank you so much for the privilege, but just call me Dan.
Okay, yeah, I'd love to call you Dan. I appreciate the invitation. Well, Dr. Allender's a prominent Christian therapist, an author, a professor, and a speaker who focuses on the issue of sexual abuse and trauma recovery, among many other important issues. He's also one of the founders and former president of the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology in Seattle, Washington, and he's the author of numerous books, including The Wounded Heart, Bold Love, The Cry of the Soul, Intimate Allies, and God Loves Sex. And Dr. Allender, I can only imagine that many of our listeners probably know who you are. They might know quite a bit about you, but there might be a few who aren't really familiar with you or your work. So if there was a person who didn't know a single thing about this guy named Dan Allender, and you were going to say just a little bit about yourself in the way of introduction, how would you describe this guy named Dan Allender?
Well, it's a great question. I think I would say I'm a grandfather, and that gives you a sense of both my age and one of the sweetest privileges of the last, hopefully, 10, 20 years of my life in the presence of four beings that two grandsons, two granddaughters, and a new grandson arriving around August. So I would say nothing is more important to me than the privilege of being able to watch my children parent their children. I never thought I would have a privilege as great as that. So that's probably first and foremost. And then second, I do get the opportunity to talk about the reality of sexuality, particularly an often unaddressed issue, and that is how we deal with our own sexual struggles today from the lens of the unaddressed sexual abuse of our past.
Awesome. That's wonderful. And man, can I relate to what you're saying about kids and grandkids, because I'm honored to be the grandfather of three beautiful granddaughters, and my wife and I absolutely love being a grandma and grandpa. It's one of the greatest blessings we've ever had. And I say to my wife on occasion, I feel such intense love for these little girls. I'm like, did we love our kids this much? I don't remember loving my own kids as much as I love my granddaughters. Of course, we love our children, but I think it's just there's something different and something sweet and awesome about grandkids.
Oh, it is. And in many ways, you don't bear the same failure. Therefore, you don't bear the same responsibility or sorrow with regard to the harm that we've done to our own children. And so I think there is a closer sweetness to what all good relationships are meant to be. But as much as I love my grandchildren, and I love them, I think the greater joy for me is actually watching my children parent. And that is an amazing gift of being able to go, even for all our good and all our failures, watching our children do even better, I just think is sweet as sweet can be.
That's wonderful. Praise be to God. Well, Dan, I want to start off by thanking you personally because you have no idea how much God has used your books, your voice, your conferences, your heart, your life, your ministry, what you do to have a profound impact and contribution to my own healing journey, as well as my wife. So I'm just very grateful for how God has used you, I know, in so many people's hearts and lives, but specifically in my heart and life. One of the reasons that I have the ministry I have today, one of the reasons I'm sitting here talking to you today is because of how God has used you in my own healing journey. So I'm just very grateful.
Thank you. That's so kind, so kind.
And if I could share just a quick story with you in the way of introduction, my wife and I have been married for 33 years now. And if you knew our story, you'd know that we are a living miracle because we literally went to hell and back in the context of our marriage. And at least the first 10 years of our marriage, and most of my listeners will know this because they've heard my story, I've talked about it at length, but at least the first 10 or 12 years of our marriage were a total disaster. And at the epicenter of our disaster was basically the issue of sex. Because my wife and I, although we didn't understand it at the time, we were both profoundly broken people in and around the area of our sexual selves. My wife had a sexual aversion, and she basically never, ever wanted to have sex with me for prolonged periods of time. I myself was a young man with a sexual addiction that I didn't understand and I hadn't dealt with. So we were just kind of a mess together. And I ended up acting out, became involved in several adulterous affairs. And, Jesus said in John 10:10, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And without a doubt, the evil one was literally trying to perpetrate destruction upon our lives, our family, our souls, our marriage, our home. And so we were just very deeply broken. So through a series of events, we ended up going to a Christian counselor here in St. Louis. We started this therapeutic process. And when we started counseling, almost immediately, our counselor invited us to get into these things that were called wounded heart groups. So I got in a men's wounded heart group. My wife got in a woman's wounded heart group. And so we were exposed to this book, The Wounded Heart, by Dr. Dan Allender. And then that led to Bold Love by Dr. Dan Allender. And this was our introduction, really, in our therapeutic process, and your work in these books really invited us to begin to journey into the stories of our lives, the story of our past, the story of our abuse and trauma and these things that had happened to us that had so wounded our souls and our hearts and our lives that we didn't understand. And these things followed us into our marriage. And so it was your influence and your books that were right there at the beginning of our healing journey and were very instrumental in our healing process. So that's the story. And again, I just say thank you.
Well, and what courage in the midst of what brokenness to not give up, to not shut down and just say there is no hope. I think for anyone hearing your story, there's the reality that it almost sounds like it's better to cut the losses, move on, simply sort of admit you made a bad decision, she made a bad decision, you two are too broken. That's why the gospel constantly calls us back to the sweetness, but also the defiance of the resurrection, and to be in that hope-filled agony. In many ways, there must have been weeks, months, years of really wondering if the gospel is true. But your story brings us right back to the reality that, if we're willing to deal with so much of the root issues behind our sexual struggles, then we've got a very different framework rather than grit it, buck up, just try harder, and somehow, hopefully, it will be better the next time.
Oh, that's so well said, Dan. And it's absolutely true, because I can't tell you how often I wanted to give up, and I know my wife wanted to give up, but somehow, with God's grace and mercy, we continued to move forward, and it was worth it, because God's healing, God's redemption is a miracle, and it's awesome. And it is painful for sure. The journey often is very painful, but what I like about it, it's pain with a purpose. It's pain that's accomplishing something, as opposed to what I call stupid pain or worthless pain.
Yeah.
And so God is good. Well, if I could mention my agenda for the rest of our visit, Dan, the Power of Purity ministry was born out of the deepest brokenness of my own heart and life. And since the primary theme of this podcast concerns kind of the intersection of men and sex, so I want to ask you a few questions about the topics of men and sex in general. But before we do that, I think what I'd like to do is ask you some questions specifically around the issue of sexual abuse, because that's what you specialize in. So I want to make sure that we cover those bases and we have enough time to kind of talk about that a little bit. And then the third vignette, if we have a little time at the end, I have a little game that I'd like to play with you for a few minutes if you're willing to give it a try.
Well, sounds intriguing.
Okay. So first off, can you explain or define the definition of sexual abuse?
Well, Tony, the essence of it is this. When someone uses you for their sexual enjoyment, for their sexual power, and you had no choice, you had no freedom because of your age or because of the power of the perpetrator to be able to stop the intrusion, the perpetration of sexual harm. So literally, having someone show you pornography is a form of sexual abuse. Most of the first encounters men have with sexuality, someone else introduced them. And even if it was pleasurable, even if it felt arousing, the bottom line is that was a violation of your purity, your innocence, your heart. So oftentimes we view being touched, molested, groped, or introduced to sexual images, sounds, or events as just sort of like, well, either a benefit, like, well, that was great, or we see it in a minor, of course, we've all had those kinds of experiences. But again, what I'm arguing is that when you have been violated, there will be consequences with regard to your heart, your mind, your body, your soul, that we've got to take into account to have a better sense of what the evil one really is attempting to accomplish through sexual violation.
Right. Very good. One of the things that I learned from you very early on, Dan, from the book, The Wounded Heart, well, I'm reading now, page 30, your definition of sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is any contact or interaction, either visual, verbal, or psychological, between a child or adolescent and an adult, when the child or adolescent is being used for the sexual stimulation of the perpetrator or any other person. And the thing that was profound about that to me, see, my understanding of sexual abuse was the proverbial or the metaphorical image of what happens to a man, let's say, in prison, when 5 or 6 or 8 other inmates gang up on him, hold him down, and he's physically, forcibly raped by other men. That's my concept of sexual abuse. That's what I thought. Well, I've never been sexually abused. Nobody's ever forced themselves upon me with a kind of violence. And so when I learned from you that sexual abuse can be visual in nature or verbal, in other words, there doesn't have to be any physical contact whatsoever. So in the way of example, one person, a man I was speaking with, when he was growing up, he would go to this house in the neighborhood, and whenever he was spending the night, the woman of the household would essentially expose herself to him, and she would act in such a way that she didn't know that he was seeing her, and it was only later that he realized, oh my gosh, she was doing that on purpose. So we see there was no physical touch, but there was a visual contact, and therefore that would constitute sexual abuse.
Absolutely. It's what we often forget is that evil works more often through covert and almost what you might call initially incidental events that don't seem like huge drama and violation, as you put it. And yet, in that subtlety, it's often very difficult to name.
Right. That's so shrewd of evil, always coming in the back door like that. Well, my next question, can you tell us statistically how many people are sexually abused, or said another way, how common is sexual abuse? Do we know that?
Yeah, we have a pretty good idea. And yet some of this depends on our definition of abuse. So when you look at what could be a legal definition of abuse that would actually be called a crime, we have data easily that 1 out of every 3 women have been abused, and approximately 1 out of every 4 men have been abused. When we actually increase our understanding of abuse to include visual, even one encounter, meaning exhibitionism, just one encounter of a man publicly displaying his genitalia to a woman, we jump to literally 1 out of 2 women. And we don't have much more research with regard to men and visual abuse, but that's why I say if we begin to include the introduction of pornography by an older or more knowledgeable, sophisticated child to another child, whether there's mutual touch or individual touch in the presence of one another, we're talking about the reality of the intrusion of subtle and yet highly profound, damaging material that will often stay in the heart and mind and body for decades, if not a lifetime.
Wow. So the bottom line is way more people have been sexually abused at some point in their life than maybe they even realize.
Oh, I think that is a phenomenal, and again, some people will assume that that's a presumptive statement, but my work and my interactions with men across and not just countless churches in the United States, we're talking about over the world, have a history, in part because, look, the return on investment for evil, for only a matter of how long does it take to abuse a boy or girl? Seconds, literally, seconds.
Wow.
And what's the effect? Over a shadowing of human heart with shame, with contempt, with reenactment structures where repetition of the past abuse gets played out with violence against oneself and others. I mean, the damage is inconceivable for such a small investment. So that's why I would argue, if you understand the kingdom of darkness, you understand, in essence, why evil used sexuality to bring about such lifetime relational, spiritual, physical harm to the unity and core beauty of the human heart.
Wow. That is so powerful, Dan. And you're getting ahead of me a little bit because I was going to ask some questions related to what you're saying there. Listening to you speak, I see in pictures sometimes. So I'm picturing, imagine if you threw a rock, a pretty big rock in a still pond or a small lake. And of course, there'd be a splash and then there'd be ripples, right? So there's cause and effect. And it's amazing the way you just said that the way that one event could happen literally in just a few minutes of a person's life. That's the cause, the splash. But then the ripples will just resonate, reverberate through their life like they never stop. The ripples keep moving out from that event throughout a person's lifetime, and that's pretty scary.
It is. It's similar, as you put it so well, but like an earthquake and the aftershocks.
Right.
Those aftershocks, sadly, I'm serious when I say it, can not only go on in this lifetime, but have the potential literally to ruin our eternity. So it's crucial for us, as you have put it well, to address not only our current struggle, but to allow the linkage of our struggle with masturbation, struggle with pornography, struggle with affairs, whatever the sexual struggles are, we need to have a larger picture to see, in many ways, the grand narrative working against us.
Right. Very good. So that brings us to a point that I feel like is so significant. I feel like this is one of the main points that I just hope and pray that some of our listeners will consider, because I just believe that many more men have been sexually abused at some point in their life than they've ever understood. They've never realized or connected the dots or realized that what happened to them was actually sexual abuse. And in the way of example, I already mentioned that when I was in my therapeutic process many years ago, when I started my process, I got in a wounded heart group. And this was a group of men. There was 8 of us in the group. We were going through the book, your book, The Wounded Heart, which helps us deal with the sexual abuse that we experienced when we were young, when we were children or adolescents, whenever this occurred. And so there were 8 men in this group. And what we did early on in our group is we took 1 week or 1 session, and each man was going to share his story with the group so we could kind of get to know each other. So we took 8 weeks to do this. And the point I'm getting to is that when the group began, of the 8 men, all 8 of us, Dan, all 8 of us, none of us understood that we had been sexually abused. We were all in the place where we minimized and we denied and rationalized, oh yeah, that happened to me, but that wasn't sexual abuse. And as each man shared his story in the group, the other 7 men in the group could see, oh my God, dude, that was sexual abuse. When that happened, that was sexual abuse. All 7 men could see the sexual abuse in each man's life, but that man himself struggled with seeing and naming that what happened to him was indeed sexual abuse. And by the way, Dan, I don't know if you remember this or not, because this is going way back, years ago, over 15, maybe closer to 20 years ago. But I was in that group, and you were doing a Wounded Heart seminar here in St. Louis. And so I arranged at the time, I contacted your office, and we arranged, since you were going to be in St. Louis, to meet my Wounded Heart group, the 8 men, for lunch. And so we went to the conference, and then you came to lunch with us and met with our Wounded Heart group in St. Louis. I don't know if you remember that, but that's who I am. I don't know if you...
I have to confess, you're dealing with a grandfather, and you are as well one. So I'll have to confess, my brain does not hold that, but I'm so delighted I had that privilege. I just wish I remembered it.
Yeah, well, we had a great time, and we had a good lunch and a good conversation, and we felt really blessed to meet with you, the author of the very book that we were going through and that God was using to help change our hearts and our lives. But all that leads to this question then: why is it so hard for so many men to see and admit and name the reality that what happened to them really was sexual abuse?
Well, I think there are 2 things that immediately need to be said, and you've done so well in illustrating that we don't even understand what it is. And so it's crucial that we've got categories. I mean, it's like a map. Until you have clarity of where you are and where you need to go and what the terrain is between those 2 spots, we're going to get lost for the forest because of the trees. So our task, in some ways, with the book, and since you went through that, we created an online course to shepherd men and women through the process of beginning to name what is abuse, what is the damage of abuse,
awesome.
What's the issue of shame, what's the issue of contempt, what's the issue of reenactment, repetition of sexual struggles. So part of the task is you need to get data, but the second bigger issue is shame. I mean, there's so much shame that I was like 16-1 men abuse. And so that means the majority listening to this are going to have been abused by some other man. And so now we have the issue of same-sex arousal. And for many of us, it was our first sexual experience in relationship to an older, more powerful child or adult.
Right.
So right there, we've got so much shame. And then second, we have got so much shame over the fact that we felt powerless. We felt like we could not stop. And a man feels to some degree like he should have power and control over his life. And then when you add that men are not weak, men don't cry, men don't suffer in that sense of culturally a strong man is able to hold his own inner world with control. You've got three factors that make it virtually impossible, seemingly, for men to begin to address abuse. We run like 4 recovery weeks every year for men and women, but we fill it with so many more women. We've actually gone for 3 years now without offering a recovery week for men because we couldn't get enough men to actually attend.
Wow.
We're talking about a deep cultural shame that has to be overcome at that easy but impossible level. Easy, I mean, because it's simple, to be able to say that touch, that visual interaction, that intrusion of violating my innocence has huge repercussions. So that, I think, is what keeps many men from being able to name what they need to name.
Wow. That's well said. Well, I already mentioned in John 10:10, Jesus said, "The thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but I've come that you might have life and have it to the full." So we therefore know that there is an enemy to our soul that literally wants to perpetrate harm and destruction upon our lives. And I have this sense, Dan, that it's like evil intuitively knows. Evil is shrewd, and it's like evil somehow intuitively knows if I can deeply and profoundly harm this person in the area of their sexuality, and preferably as early in their life as possible, 4, 6, 8, 10 years old, that's the deepest way that I could ever harm this person and bring destruction upon their lives. It's as if evil knows that somehow sexual harm and damage is the deepest and most significant way to perpetrate harm and damage and destruction upon the human soul. I'm picturing right now, as I say that, I'm seeing a picture, and it's kind of silly, so forgive me, but I'm thinking of the movie Independence Day. Will Smith was in it, and if you remember, the aliens were coming to planet Earth to take over, and so we're trying to fight them, and we're shooting bombs and missiles, and then they shoot an atomic bomb, and they can't get through the force field that's protecting these enemy aircraft. And as the story unfolds, they figure out a way to get inside, and there's this scene where I think Randy Quaid played the character, but he flies his airplane into the epicenter of the enemy ship. And then the whole thing blows up. What I'm saying is evil wants to get to the deepest place it can possibly get to detonate that harm and destruction and perpetrate damage. And it's almost like evil knows if I can hurt a person sexually, it's like that's the deepest hurt, and I'm going to have them for life. So can you speak to why sexual harm in a person's life and soul carries such profound implications and consequences for their life?
Well, let's put it this way, Tony. When abuse occurs, there was always grooming beforehand. There was always someone setting you up by reading you and learning how your heart missed delight, honor, care. So trust, they develop trust with you. And evil's plan through that is to create a betrayal that makes trusting God or anyone else so very difficult. Not only that, but evil wants you to feel powerless through that process. Like you have no place, no control, which in turn brings us a sense of hopelessness. So right there, you've got two of the core things that evil wishes to do: to ruin faith, to ruin hope, and most deeply, it wants for there to be shame over what your body felt. In that sense that when you're touched or when you're given access to sexual images or sounds or events, our bodies will be aroused. They were meant to be aroused. Of course,
yes.
Never aroused in the context of abuse, but our body doesn't differentiate that this is sexually abusive versus what I was made for. Our body simply knows arousal. And that arousal, especially for a boy who's touched by a man, a boy who's touched by an older woman, that arousal is going to feel deathly, going to feel constricting and contemptuous, because our bodies know we're being used. So in that light, our shame for arousal is so phenomenal that we don't know how to metabolize the confusion of such a good pleasure with such violating harm. And so often what happens is we go blind, we go deaf, we allow our hearts to sort of get into radical denial or what's called dissociation in order to escape all the faith ruined, hope lost, and in some ways love entangled with this darkness of shame.
Wow, that's very powerful. Hey guys, I hate to do it, but I see from the clock that we're out of time for today's episode, so I'm going to go ahead and interrupt the discussion at this point and invite you to come back next week with part 2 of our interview with Dr. Dan Allender. I really appreciate Dr. Allender being here with us today and next week. It's an awesome discussion, and we have so much to learn from him. So I hope it's a blessing, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week with part 2 of our interview with Dr. Dan Allender. God bless you.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.